I'm Carole Taylor. On this edition of Journal, we look at the sad Vancouver tale of the rise and fall of Woodwards on Hastings Street. Built in 1903, the Woodwards building was the place to be in Vancouver, a one-stop department store famous for its renowned food floor. Glory days. But few things stay the same forever. Woodward's decline began in the 60s as both shopping patterns and Vancouver's Downtown Eastside began to change. Many shoppers chose the shiny new suburban malls rather than the deteriorating downtown location. Woodward's losses began to mount company-wide until they declared bankruptcy in 1993, 90 years after its much-celebrated opening on Hastings Street. But that wasn't the end of the Woodward story. The heritage building remained empty until the city bought it in 2001 with grand visions of a revitalized anchor for the east side of downtown Vancouver, providing homes and services for the community. This project was controversial from the outset, with some fighting against this so-called gentrification, while others worried too much social housing in one project would not work. But reopen it did in 2009 with much fanfare about the anchor tenants who were supporting the redevelopment. Nestor's Market, TD Bank, London Drugs, J.J. Bean, among others. But that was then, and this is now. TD Bank has closed its doors. J.J. Bean is gone. And now London Drugs has announced its imminent closure. The reasons are all similar. Increased crime and disorder on the streets, worry about safety for staff and customers, and financial losses. Clint Mahlman, CEO of London Drugs, joins me to talk about this difficult decision. It's so good to see you again, Clint. Last time we were together on a stage, it was for the SOS Jesse Ketchum's conference on how difficult retail is these days. And so given your recent story about having to close the London Drugs, I thought it was a perfect time for us to reunite. But before we talk about your actual decision, if you back up to when London Drugs decided to move into the Woodwards complex, the big dream and everything, what were your expectations at that point?
Sure. Well, it's great to see you again, Carole. It was around 2007 where the vision of the Woodwards redevelopment was starting to be pitched. It was obviously a lot of decisions had been made by the city and the province at that point, but the vision of what retail could be to support the community was starting to come alive. Obviously, it takes a number of years before a retailer decides to go in there. And certainly what was pitched to us was a changing investment in the neighborhood. Of course, we don't see anywhere near the level of street crime and disorder that exists today or the last decade. It was, I would call it, much milder at that point. We didn't see the level of violence for sure. And so we and the Jim Pattison Group and many others bought into the vision and opened our store in December of 2009. And it became apparent within probably a couple of years that whatever vision was expected to help transform the downtown east side, not just buildings and gentrification as it's called, but also the supports for the community. And we didn't start to see it happen, and that's where we started to have this sense of things were going to be difficult in the neighborhood. But we also at the same time saw streetscapes across British Columbia, and quite frankly Western Canada, but most acute in British Columbia, in downtowns like downtown Nanaimo, certainly downtown Victoria. And we started getting reports even back then that this street disorder issue was starting to result in the emptying of downtowns, lots of different reasons for impacting the business climate, of course, during that time. That 2009 was just coming out of one of our worst financial recessions at the time. But that's when we first started to send the alarm to all levels of government we could as a company to say, we see something happening. And if there isn't something addressed, there will be a desertscape start to happen like what was already ahead of us in the US.
Oh, and so it flowed.
Mm-hmm.
Can you describe the kind of experience you had as a business person and for your employees, like specifics? Because I don't think a lot of people really understand how bad it is.
Yeah, I think it's horrible is the summary of it. But can you imagine if you were an MP or an MOA, a judge, a Crown prosecutor, and every day when you came to work, you had to step over human feces. Someone who maybe broken into your office the night before and defecated in the office. You were having to constantly pay those repair bills of the theft and damage created, vandalism, spray painting on windows as an example. And then, of course, the worst of all is the physical and verbal violence against employees. And I think a lot of people have this connotation as, well, how bad could it really be? Well, you imagine being chased around a store by an axe, machete, a pipe, a gun. Those are not uncommon. These aren't exaggerations. We've had employees throughout Western Canada assaulted with snow shovels and pieces of the equipment that we use to hold merchandise. And there's lots of different reasons for it, but this cost is not just a financial cost, and this is one of the key things we've tried to emphasize to every decision maker involved in the justice system. Well, there are certainly massive financial costs, but it's the psychological cost to our employees and to the community that ultimately, as a retailer, you rely on traffic to visit your stores. And if you don't have that traffic, it doesn't matter how beautiful you build the store, what your prices are, people won't come. And this is what we've started to see throughout British Columbia. And so those type of things are common. And just to give you an example, I was recently visiting our Saskatoon store before Christmas, and we have a code when our loss prevention people have seen someone leave the store without paying, go out to the parking lot to support them. They were trying their best to control this person who was very, very aggressive. And what did I see in the person's hand? He had his car keys ready to stab our loss prevention people. You know, that is common. So what do you do? As a business person, that our first and primary responsibility is for the safety of our employees and our customers. There becomes a point where we have to live up to that not only moral and ethical code, but also what's required by law to keep them safe. And right now, in so many of our communities, it's not the same way as it used to be. And the governments haven't understood that the combination of factors, such as retail margins have always been skinny, and they've got incredibly skinny in these last several years with a lot of other government decisions, taxes, building costs as an example. So something as simple as loss prevention or theft costs can make the difference between whether a retailer is profitable or not.
Can you put any number on that? What kind of, especially for Woodwards, what kind of loss numbers you were dealing with?
As a private family company, we don't disclose our financials, but I'll give you some parameters. In Canada, it's estimated that what's often referred to amongst retailers is the theft tax ranges between what you want to include in and out. About 1.5 to 3.5% of every retail price is to compensate for vandalism, theft, damage, those type of things due to street disorder. And it could be higher, certainly in some locations, like the Downtown Eastside. The other cost that happens is, of course, the human cost, because if someone's just had a traumatic event because someone's threatened their life, they often may need time off. They need days off, of course. We offer, of course, psychological counseling to support them. But that's also a payroll cost that you now have to deal with. And, of course, the human cost of the person's performance, not feeling well about performing the next time they come to work. What a lot of people forget is this is where municipalities have a huge impact into street disorder. So every municipality, big or small, has some sort of design construct through their planning offices of how they want their streetscapes to look. Vancouver specifically, followed by many other municipalities, fell in love many years ago with animation, as they call it. So they wanted massive, 200-300 foot or 50-meter sections of nothing but glass. So from the street, it looked like there was something happening. And of course, the light from the inside businesses was cascading out. Great from a design concept. On average, those panes of window to protect ourselves are $7,000 to $10,000 because you can't just put up a normal pane of glass. You've effectively created an aquarium that someone can look and go, I would like to steal that. I would like to pre-plan my theft. And of course, just breaking through in the middle of the night, which has been well documented, whether it be a bank, a restaurant, a retailer, is common. Those are tens of thousands of dollars. So some other numbers, we had an 800% increase in our loss prevention costs in the last few years at that store at Hastings and Abbott. And that's our number one cost. It used to be municipal taxes in the last few years, but now loss prevention costs are our number one cost increase as a company. And so the costs of these things just continue to drive into these decisions. It's about people first. Absolutely, that's our first and foremost lens that we look at things, but it has to be also about the viability of the business. In that location, we've lost over $10 million and we're getting closer to $20 million. And of course, we bought into the vision of that area. We wanted to be a good corporate citizen. London Drugs has a very long reputation about giving back to the community, disproportionate to our size. But there becomes a point of reasonableness that no business should be asked to bear those costs on behalf of the area to help support the area when we don't see an outcome changing.
And sadly, this is not a one-off story because Gourmet Warehouse, she tells the same story about broken glass and threats. And
absolutely.
We're going to try and look at some of the perhaps solutions to this right after this break. Clint talked a couple of times, in fact, about your trying to approach government, trying to talk to politicians, trying to get the story out there before it became such a crisis. What would their response be to you?
Well, I think it's always an acknowledgement, big smile, we understand, that's new information, whether it be the senior bureaucrats or the politicians. A lot of promises and very little follow-up, quite frankly. An example is I spoke to Premier Eby just prior to the election when it was first rumored we might close that Hastings and Abbott location. And there was all sorts of promises. He was able to find my cell phone, no problem prior to the election.
What kind of promises would he make?
Well, it was things like just hold on, please don't make any decisions. We're working with the City of Vancouver. We have some concepts we think will make a difference. And so, you want to respect those promises, but they don't materialize. Meeting at City Hall, Mayor Ken Sims deserves a lot of credit where he pulled together Minister Farnworth at the time, who was responsible for the public safety file, the now Chief Constable for VPD, along with the deputies, senior bureaucrats from the province. And there was all this, please don't do anything, we've got a plan. And really, the Vancouver Police, who deserve probably the most credit, they're the ones that stepped up. Minister Farnworth at the time had promised some funding, which he delivered, but he made it very clear, which I understand from government budgets, it has to end at a certain point. And Vancouver Police have continued to fund that along with the City of Vancouver. In early of the year, we met online with Premier Eby, then Minister Beggs, Minister of State Young. One of the things that Save Our Streets has been pushing for is accessible statistics that are reliable and that are universal, so we can all set goals and measure targets. Lots of promises. We've never had a follow-up from that. And those are the type of things that sadly happen time after time. And I think that's why there's such despair amongst those in the communities that are affected by the street disorder, is they don't see the government taking it seriously. On the flip side, we have seen some light from the federal government. Just last week, the minister responsible for public safety for the federal government met with retailers and service providers, restaurateurs in downtown Prince George, because that's another area where the street disorder is getting out of control, and a lot of support there. So we see action in the federal government. I can tell you my conversations with them, they're very frustrated with the province. As they say, we can create all the bail change, we can create all the expectations, but it's the province's constitutional authority to execute on that law and administer the justice. So our concern is everyone's focused on blame, and from a Save Our Streets perspective, we're focused on solutions. We want this to be nonpartisan. And we've reflected to the governments, look at how well you perform together, opposition and in power, all levels during COVID. It was a public health emergency, just like the street drug issue is. You were able to get through the bureaucratic mess to have solutions. You consulted significantly with both the private and the public sector and institutions to find the best solutions quickly, and you worked in concert. Why, if you're able to do that at that point, it tells us that the motivation, ability, and interest is doing it if there's enough political will. And so we reflect back to them that that's the type of action we need, no more words.
But it hasn't happened.
It hasn't happened.
Tell me about the role the police have played in trying to give you support.
Well, the police, whether it be in Vancouver or elsewhere, they all have different mandates and they're serving different issues regardless where it is in the province, whether it be a municipal force or the RCMP. We have seen in the last 5 years an emergence of project-based policing. So it's often called Project Barcode, which Vancouver started, but we've seen ones in Abbotsford most recently, the RCMP in different jurisdictions. But we can't police our way out of this. They have limited resources, and this is where I think the law has to be dealt with, because it's this catch, release, reoffend pattern that is degrading the public confidence in our justice system. The police are equally as frustrated. We talked to them about that, and it's a horrible waste of resources when they could be redeployed for other types of crime, when they're constantly dealing with the same repeat chronic offenders, whether they're violent or not. And as an example, very specific recommendations to both around the Crown Prosecution Service. So an example is right now, many of the Crown prosecution positions in British Columbia are not replaced. There isn't enough funding for them. And even when the government says, oh, we've got a solution, we'll do this revoy, we'll come up with this special project, well, they're pulling from an already limited amount of Crown prosecutors, not replacing them. So if a repeat offender shows up, they don't have the time to properly prepare the case. And of course, a judge can only make the judgment on the facts presented to them by the Crown at the time. And so they tell us the frustration of not being able to do their job to the degree that they'd want. And the law's issues have become more complex. If there's video involved, they have to review every ounce of video to make sure that's done. The federal government, we've said, along with the provincial government, there's tools the Crown Prosecution Service has asked for. One of them is there is no national database to tell them that a person is up on charges for theft in Calgary this morning and reoffended in Vancouver this afternoon. And this is not unusual. In fact, just before Christmas was an article by Global News about someone in Toronto, a gang, because organized retail crime is a significant driving force, offending in Vancouver shortly. Crown doesn't have the tools, a national database. That's something relatively straightforward that they could tilt up. The BC Crown Prosecution Association has said, you could fund us fully, but if there's no place to remand the offenders, chronic offenders, then we don't have the tools to do it. So this is why it has to be a thoughtful continuum with all the stakeholders together. It's right there in front of the government's nose. They just have to have the will to solve it. And those are just one example. Judges, of course, very difficult for obvious reasons to talk to judges about their perspective on this. But of a couple of the retired judges I've talked to, an example was given to me as well. We're aware of the public opinion and we're very concerned about the degrading confidence in the justice system. Part of our performance appraisals as a judge is how many times we have a case appealed. So as any human nature, you want to make sure you're accurate, and judges, of course, are so fact-based, but they're human. So if you're worried about advancing a decision to better reflect the public confidence in the justice system, but you're also faced with a review from your boss about a potential appeal, that's problematic in our system. And there's all these little nuances of why I think all create excuses for the justice system to move forward and actually deal with what the public has hired them to do, either directly through voting or through the proxy of the systems, is to execute at a different level to restore public confidence in the justice system, and more importantly, to protect our citizens. That's a fundamental principle that every single government's first and primary responsibility is to.
One of the big problems I've always found is the data situation. I hadn't realized between provinces they don't share it. But a lot of business people have told me they no longer report these things because, first of all, the insurance goes through the roof and it takes a while for the police to get there.
Absolutely true, Carole. I mean, when Save Our Streets did a poll just prior to the provincial election, it was very clear. Almost 66% of the people polled through a very robust, statistically valid poll said they'd lost faith in the justice system. And many reported in the same poll that they don't call in offenses. And this is what drives us crazy. So, for example, last week there was a lot announced in the local media about crime appears to be down. Well, there's a huge issue and gap between incidents of crime versus actual crime.
I think that's an important distinction we should all be aware of. Well, I know it was a tough decision for London Drugs to say we have to close it down, but hopefully everyone understands a little bit more how awful it actually was. Thank you, Clint, for joining us.
Thank you so much.
Back in a sec. With the departure of Woodward's key tenants, Michael Geller, architect and urban planner, worries that this might mark the end of trying to make this area of downtown Vancouver appealing to families and young professionals. What happens next to this grand plan is anyone's guess. Let me know your thoughts on YouTube. Till next time, I'm Carole Taylor.